I was searching through a digitized collection of 18th-century cartographic surveys when I noticed something that should not exist. Across maps attributed to French and Dutch engravers, spanning decades that should have seen incremental change, entire urban clusters appeared fully formed and then simply vanished from later editions. Cities with elaborate basilicas, arched viaducts, and star-shaped fortifications were rendered in meticulous detail, yet their names align with no settlement recognized by official record. The annotations are precise: scale bars, latitudinal coordinates, trade route markers, but the accompanying texts fall silent. No foundation charters, no municipal chronicles, no bishopric registers. It felt less like an omission and more like a deliberate unmaking. I am not speaking of mythical kingdoms or allegorical cartouches. I am speaking of mapped urban footprints across a vast territory labeled Tartaria, often depicted with a density of monumental architecture that rivals any contemporaneous European capital. Why would engineers capable of fabricating navigational instruments and hydrological systems be remembered only as scattered tribes? The question is not whether such cities existed. The question is why their material reality, stone by stone, seems to have been methodically withdrawn from the historical ledger. Every investigation into the erased cities of Tartaria eventually collides with the same unyielding wall. A wall built not of brick, but of narrative consensus. The standard account describes a fluid patchwork of nomadic confederations roaming the Eurasian steppe, leaving behind little more than burial mounds and oral epics. That depiction is not entirely false, but it is painfully incomplete, and its incompleteness is the first thread worth pulling. When you examine the documentary evidence that sits outside the accepted corpus, a far stranger picture emerges. It begins with cartography, because maps are ideological documents disguised as navigational tools. The Fra Mauro Mappa Mundi, completed around 1450, already inscribes numerous fortified cities deep in the territory later called Tartary. Antonio Zatta's Atlas of 1776 dedicates an entire folio to Tartaria Independiente and Tartaria Moscovita, peppering the landscape with town symbols dense enough to suggest a continuous urban corridor running from the Volga basin to the Pacific littoral. These are not the conjectural tents of a wanderer's camp. They are stylized icons of permanent masonry, frequently annotated with descriptors implying administrative complexity. One French military map from 1712 marks a settlement named Turcan with a double circle, a convention reserved for provincial capitals. Yet no corresponding archaeological site has ever been officially catalogued by modern survey institutes. The absence triggers a cascade of uncomfortable questions. Were these mapmakers engaged in wholesale fabrication across multiple competing publishing houses? If so, why risk their commercial reputations on phantom cities when they could easily leave blank space, as they did in unexplored Africa? The commercial logic collapses under scrutiny. A more disquieting possibility is that the cities were real, systematically documented, and then systematically dismantled, not only physically, but archivally. The destruction would have required an institutional effort spanning governments, learned societies, and the nascent discipline of historiography itself. When the Imperial Russian Academy began its geographic expeditions in the early 1700s, field reports described enormous ruined foundations along the Irtysh River, colossal brick wells, and traces of an advanced canal network that local Bashkir elders attributed to an ancient sedentary people they called the White Tsars. Those reports were published in limited academic bulletins, then quietly excluded from subsequent compendiums. I wonder if a single surviving fragment of that canal engineering, measured and sketched but never spoken of again, might reshape the entire chronology of Northern Asia. What makes the inconsistency so troubling is the architectural language that appears whenever a supposed Tartarian ruin is examined before it can be reburied or dismissed. During the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway in the 1890s, work crews near Krasnoyarsk exposed dressed granite blocks cut with a precision that required hardened steel tools, interlocked without mortar, in a style reminiscent of megalithic Peruvian masonry. The engineers recorded their astonishment in internal railway correspondence. They had been told to expect permafrost and primitive soil, not a subterranean city quarter of cyclopean dimensions. Official explanations for these finds tended to arrive late and fit poorly. The blocks were natural basalt formations. The workers mistook glacial erratics for human artifice. The site was a Bronze Age kurgan, exaggerated by journalistic hysteria. Those deflections are plausible in isolation. Accumulated across a dozen remote locations, spanning from the Altai Mountains to the Kazakh uplands, they begin to form a pattern of reflex negation. Geology does not normally produce squared column drums in perfectly aligned rows, nor does it leave behind copper alloy clamps poured into dovetail grooves. Yet you will rarely find these features catalogued by university departments of archaeology, because the classification framework itself appears engineered to filter them out. A structure found in Siberia that exhibits the hallmarks of advanced sedentary engineering cannot be Tatar, because Tatars have been historiographically defined as mobile pastoralists. Therefore, the structure must be either misidentified, misdated, or placed there by another civilization entirely, such as a distant Greek or Persian outpost. The reasoning is circular, and it keeps the grid of historical possibility tightly closed. So tightly closed, in fact, that when amateur researchers locate a pre-19th century photograph of a standing stone citadel in Omsk, complete with arrow slits and a machicolated parapet, the standard response is to label it a Tsarist military folly from the late 1700s, even when the construction technique predates any known Russian fortress typology by at least 2 centuries. I invite you to consider what it would mean for our understanding of cultural evolution if those orphaned stones were once part of a sprawling urban network whose blueprint was deliberately misfiled. The misfiling of a blueprint becomes a deliberate act only when you discover how methodically the supporting documents were purged. In the Siberian archives of the Imperial Geographic Society, I found catalogue entries for photographic albums dated 1881, titled Monuments of Ancient Architecture in the Kyrgyz Steppe, with each volume marked as withdrawn for conservation in 1936 and never returned. No copies exist in any digital database. All that survives is a single handwritten index, listing frame after frame of towering brick minarets, double-vaulted caravanserais, and sprawling necropolis complexes built from fired clay bricks of a standardized module that reappears from the Black Sea to Mongolia. The module, a precise 12 by 6 by 3 inches, is not a natural variation. It is an industrial specification that implies a shared system of measurement, kiln technology, and architectural education across thousands of miles. When that brick size turns up in the earliest colonial settlements of the American West, in the foundations of Fort Ross in California, for instance, or in the ruined bastions of the Presidio district, the conventional explanation is that Russian fur traders brought the technique with them in the early 1800s. But the Russian traders themselves acknowledged in their logs that they had copied the method from ancient Tatar structures they encountered east of the Urals. The chain of transmission points backward, not forward, and the source is a civilization that official history insists built nothing more permanent than a felt tent. I find it increasingly difficult to dismiss the possibility that we are looking at the dismembered limbs of a single architectural organism. severed and scattered by a force that demanded its coherence be forgotten. What force could wield that kind of historical erasure? The question leads not to a secret society, but to a perfectly mundane, ruthlessly effective institution, the cadastral state. Empires rewrite land. When the Romanov dynasty completed its subjugation of what it called the Tatar Khanates between the 16th and 18th centuries, it did not merely occupy territory, it reclassified it. Old land registries were burned, tax records were replaced, and entire urban centers were redesignated as new Russian foundations by imperial decree. The city of Tomsk, supposedly established in 1604 as a wooden frontier fort, appears on a Swedish engraving from 1692 as a walled city of dense stone masonry with 37 watchtowers, a scale that could not have been achieved in 8 decades with convict labor alone. I compared the engraving with early Tsarist chronicles describing Tomsk as a small ostrog of pine logs. The dissonance is so extreme that one can only conclude that the chronicles were describing a different, diminished settlement that inherited the name of a far older urban center already standing there. The older city was then physically dismantled. Its bricks were likely crushed for road ballast, its iron fittings smelted down, its foundations buried under new administrative buildings that now bear brass plaques celebrating Catherine the Great's urban planning. That is not conspiracy, that is logistics. How many other Tomsks lie buried under administrative plaques, waiting for someone to compare the engraving with the ground? The Tomsk engraving is not an isolated anomaly. It belongs to a class of documentary evidence that historians call orphan depictions, images or descriptions of structures that predate any known builder, orphaned from their origin. Across the territory once labeled Tartaria, these orphans form a hidden catalogue of staggering scale. Consider the Omsk citadel photographs from the 1860s that show vast brick bastions with arched sallyports buried up to their lintels in packed earth, their lower courses already underground. Official reports attributed this to urban debris accumulation, a slow rise of street level over centuries. But street level does not bury entire ground floors in a uniform stratum across 3,000 miles, unless something catastrophic or programmatic occurred. When excavation teams in Barnaul unearthed a perfectly preserved cobblestone street 4 meters below the modern surface in 1924, they also found horse tram tracks cast in iron, copper water pipes with threaded joints, and the charred remains of a wooden aqueduct, infrastructure that could not have been installed by nomads and could not have vanished without deliberate removal from cultural memory. The geologist who documented the find, Vasily Obruchev, noted in his private field diary that the layer above the street contained exclusively sterile clay, devoid of organic matter, as if placed there in a single rapid event. His official publication, however, omitted that detail and instead described alluvial deposition over an indeterminate period. The discrepancy between the private observation and the public record is the fingerprint of a systematic retouching of reality, and Obruchev was not alone. Dozens of geologists and railway engineers across the empire recorded similar stratigraphy, a buried, technologically advanced layer sealed beneath a geologically implausible cap, only to have their findings softened into conventional phrasing by editorial committees in St. Petersburg. That editorial pressure points to a deeper unease within the academic establishment, an unease that crystallizes around the Star Fort. If you trace the distribution of star-shaped bastion fortifications with acute, triangular ravelins, you will find them ringing not only the Baltic and the French frontier, but also the remote Kazakh steppe, the Amur River, and the Great Lakes of North America. The standard attribution assigns these structures to various early modern empires: Tsarist Russia, the Qing, the French, the British, each supposedly building them during the 17th and 18th centuries. Yet the geometric precision of a star fort requires trigonometrical surveying skills and earth-moving capacities that would have been ruinously expensive for a nascent colonial garrison. More troubling is the fact that numerous historical maps, such as the Guyot map of 1690, already depict fully realized star fortifications deep in the interior of Tartaria, annotated in a script that seems to describe them as pre-existing landmarks rather than new constructions. At the site of what is now Petropavlovsk in Kazakhstan, an 1805 watercolor by a Russian military topographer shows an abandoned star fort with fully matured trees growing from its parapets, trees that botanists estimate required at least a century to reach that diameter. The fort, therefore, existed before the Russian conquest, before the region's official pacification, before the empire that supposedly built it ever arrived. Who laid its mathematically exact glacis, and for what war that no one recorded? I can only conclude that the architectural skeleton of a lost civilization was reclothed in imperial uniforms, its builders erased not through conspiracy, but through the relentless, bureaucratic absorption of one people's monuments into another people's glory. The orphaned star fort of Petropavlovsk, standing mute with a century of tree growth in its ramparts, forces a question that most historical disciplines are structurally unequipped to ask. What if the erasure was not merely archival, but physical, operating on a scale so vast we mistake its remnants for natural topography? I began to see this scale only after cross-referencing excavation logs from 3 continents, searching not for the cities themselves, but for the ground that covered them. In every case, the same signature recurred: a homogeneous blanket of clay-rich silt, devoid of stratification, sitting directly atop paved streets, finished floor surfaces, and the lower thirds of standing masonry. Geotechnical reports from St. Petersburg, Novosibirsk, and the old quarters of Moscow describe a sterile anthropogenic deposit ranging from 1 to 4 meters in thickness, which engineers attribute vaguely to flooding, waste accumulation, or the leveling of prior construction. But the deposit contains no domestic refuse, no ceramic shards, no organic midden layers that would characterize gradual human occupation. It is a geologically clean, unnaturally uniform layer, as if the landscape was reset with a single sweeping gesture. The same deposit appears in borehole samples taken from the basements of 19th-century buildings in Boston, Seattle, and San Francisco, cities that official narratives insist were vacant wilderness before their founding. When construction crews in Lower Manhattan excavated the foundations for the Equitable Building in 1912, they broke into a buried cobblestone street, complete with iron lampposts and brick sewers at a depth that predated the Dutch settlement by at least a century, according to the pollen analysis conducted by a Columbia University botanist, whose report was later withdrawn from publication. The physical evidence keeps repeating a message that the textbooks refuse to receive. A highly sophisticated built environment, consistent in its material culture from the Urals to the Pacific Northwest, was submerged by an event or a process that institutional science has not adequately named. The material culture that unifies these buried layers is the most damning clue of all. When you hold a fired brick recovered from the subterranean level of Tobolsk next to one extracted from a sealed foundation in Portland, Oregon, the dimensional correspondence is not approximate. It is identical to within a millimeter, and both contain the same unusual admixture of volcanic ash and lime binder that modern petrographic analysis identifies as a highly durable hydraulic cement. This is not diffusion through trade. It is the fingerprint of a single architectural tradition operating across an interconnected geography. The same ash-lime matrix appears in the mortar of the Star Fort at Fort Wayne, Indiana, and in the cyclopean granite joints of the buried chambers beneath Kronstadt. Official provenance traces these materials to local workshops serving imperial military needs, but that explanation unravels when you discover that the formula appears in structures that the military engineers themselves described as ancient ruins in their initial survey notes. The erasure, then, was not only a matter of burning documents and reassigning place names. It required the systematic burial of an entire world under a mantle of clay, a mantle that conveniently severed the visual connection between the old order and the new. Whether that mantle was deposited by a cataclysm of mud, by deliberate demolition and infill, or by a century-long campaign of earth-moving conducted with technologies we no longer associate with the period, I cannot say. I can only observe that the buried layer exists, that it is continuous across continents, and that its presence has been consistently minimized by the same institutional gatekeepers who decide what counts as history and what gets classified as sediment. The residue of all this buried stone does not survive only in borehole samples and withdrawn reports. It persists in the cultural memory of the very people whose ancestors were supposedly too primitive to have built it. Across the Altai, Bashkir elders still speak of the Chud, a white-eyed race of master builders who raised great cities of brick and iron before vanishing underground when the birch trees began to grow white. The legend is invariably dismissed as mythological projection, a folk explanation for Bronze Age kurgans. But the Chud tales are far too architecturally specific to be generic folklore. They describe copper-roofed palaces, mechanical water-lifting devices, and underground passages connecting temple complexes, details that align with nothing in the steppe archaeological record, except for the very ruins that have been methodically declassified. Even more telling is the consistency of the folklore across linguistic groups that have had no contact for centuries. Mansi hunters in the northern taiga, Kalmyk herders on the Caspian Depression, and Evenki reindeer nomads in the Transbaikal all share variants of the same memory. A fallen urban civilization of astonishing technical sophistication, destroyed not by war but by a white flood or a sky fire, after which the survivors were dispersed and their names forbidden. Anthropology teaches us to treat such stories as allegory, but when oral tradition aligns with stratigraphic anomalies, dismissed photography, and cartographic evidence, the boundary between allegory and suppressed testimony begins to erode. At some point, refusing to consider the convergence becomes its own form of intellectual dishonesty. I do not stand here to tell you that I have solved the riddle of the vanished Tartarian cities. The evidence is too fragmentary, the archival damage too thorough, and the institutional resistance too deeply entrenched for any final conclusion. What I can say is that the standard historical narrative contains a void shaped exactly like the missing masonry, the buried streets, the star forts with trees older than their supposed builders. Whether that void represents a lost global civilization, a technologically advanced steppe confederation that fell to a catastrophe we have not yet acknowledged, or something stranger still, I cannot decisively prove. But the burden of proof has shifted. When geologists continue to classify a continent-spanning, culture-bearing sediment layer as natural deposition without adequate explanation, when archivists continue to mark entire photographic collections as destroyed without scanning them, and when the foundations of a vanished world keep surfacing beneath our own cities, the historian's task is no longer simply to recount the victor's version. It is to question why the victor needed to bury the evidence 4 meters deep. The stone endures. It always does. And somewhere beneath the streets of a city whose name we were told did not exist, that stone is waiting for the light to touch it again. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.